G'day folks, welcome back to our Wednesday webcast. For the last several weeks we've been talking to people around the planet about dealing with COVID-19. We started off talking really survival strategies. So how do you do the immediate crisis management when everything changes? And we've morphed over the last few weeks to talking more about recovery and longer term views, because that's where certainly we're at in Australia, and a few other parts of the world are starting to look at how do we actually emerge from lockdown. The circumstances are different for different people around the planet, and so we try to put in a good assortment for the various people that tune into the call from around the place. Today it's my very great pleasure to be talking with Grant Rawlinson. Grant's a Kiwi based up in Singapore, been there for a number of years, and he describes himself as a human-powered explorer. You're a hard man to introduce, Grant. When you look at your list of accomplishments, you've been on pretty much every continent on Earth, climbed a whole bunch of mountains that most of us have only ever seen pictures of, if that, and many of those have been exploratory first ascents. And you've paddled and rowed and ridden and walked across huge amounts of space, 50 plus expeditions under your belt and more in the pipeline. And your professional work is helping organisations and teams make decisions under pressure and build beyond resilience. So it'd be great to get your thoughts on a bit of that in the conversation today. Welcome.
Yeah, g'day Mike. It's really nice to be here, and welcome to everyone else, Doug and Tom and Sean and Bertie and June and someone else there. I can't see your name there with the tie on, sir. Sorry.
That's Kevin.
Kevin, how are you, Kevin?
So you look as though you're at base camp, Grant, but you're actually still in Singapore, relatively locked down. What's the current state of play up there for you folks at the moment in terms of lockdown and business movement?
I would say, Mike, it's a high state of uncertainty here at the moment. We've been pretty much at home for I've actually lost count of how many weeks, but somewhere 10 or 12 weeks or something. And our children started to go back to school last week. This was the first easing that we've seen with kids starting to go back to school. However, the grown-up people are still stuck at home. Last night there was an announcement from the government that they're closely monitoring it, but it will be a very, very cautious, phased approach to starting to free up some of these restrictions. And based on that, don't expect that they were very insistent on don't expect to be getting back to normal anytime soon or ever, unless there's actually some kind of vaccine for this pandemic. So yeah, highly uncertain at the moment.
Indeed, and I would imagine that'd be quite an interesting environment for you folks in Singapore as well, given how much of a global hub you are. So much international business conducted from there and through there that the shutdowns must have had a pretty significant impact, possibly beyond what some other countries have experienced. Anyway.
Yeah, I agree. Interesting, but also highly boring as well.
Indeed. So let's talk a bit about adventure. We could really easily just spend this conversation talking all about some of the amazing stuff that you've done, and that would be a great conversation in and of itself. But we'd like to get to territory that's useful to people in the current circumstance as well. How do you define adventure, mate?
So adventure for me, basically, the biggest ingredient which defines an adventure is uncertainty. Without uncertainty, you just cannot have an adventure. And this is a really interesting distinction when we look at things like adventure tourism, for example, when they get people to bungee jump and they do these activities which are perceived high risk, but actually the risk is almost zero. So there's a real difference between adventure tourism. Adventure, it's got to have commitment and it's got to have uncertainty. For me, it's got to have high levels of commitment. You've got to be put yourself into situations where if you make the wrong decisions or things go wrong, then things can really, it can be really serious. And secondly, the uncertainty part. And the uncertainty part for me is broken down into three things. The first one is, will I even make it to the other side, especially if I'm crossing seas in my boat? Will I make it to the other side, number one? If I do make it, number two, how long will it take? And number three, where will I end up on the other side?
Yeah, and certainly for some of those massive scale expeditions like rowing from Singapore to New Zealand, which you're in the midst of various legs of at the moment, those levels of uncertainty are very, very real. For me, it's really, I like those ingredients, and that kind of points to life as a bit of an adventure as well, really, that it requires commitment and there's lots of uncertainty and the outcomes are largely unknown. I think one of the things that's been interesting for me over the last few months of COVID is how much people gravitate towards trying to create this illusion of certainty. And the reality is there's a lot of what happens to us pretty much on a daily basis where we're not really sure about how it's going to end. How do you think an adventurer's mindset, what does that look like and how can it serve us?
Well, great question, and I could speak for hours about that. But I would say that in terms of decision making, and when we're in these highly volatile times, without almost any human being's choice on this planet, whether we like it or not, we're all thrust into an absolutely massive adventure. Adventure doesn't have to be positive or negative, but the fact is, whether you like it or not, you're on a massive adventure at this time because you're in a very committing situation and you're in a highly uncertain environment. So one of the things, the things that I've learned from being in this environment when it comes to decision making, which are really important, is the first thing is that you need to be very careful in highly volatile environments of making strategic decisions about the future of your project right in the middle of a storm. And, for many of us at the moment in our businesses, I run my own business, Mike, you run your own business. We need to be careful about making strategic decisions about the future of our business right in the middle of the storm. I mean, the storms generally will always pass, right? When I'm in my rowing boat, lightning storms come through for 20 minutes at a time. And I have this expression on my rowing boat, which you can see on the screen there, is that, no storms ever last. Excuse the language. I excuse the language there, but, the reason for this motto on the rowing boat is in the middle of those lightning storms, those electrical storms, which are just absolutely terrifying here in the tropics when you're in a tiny boat 50 miles offshore, the lightning striking the water all around the boat at 3 o'clock in the morning. If I had a button to push to end the expedition, I would push it right then.
Yeah.
Because I'm terrified. I don't want to be on there anymore. I would push it, but there is no button. And this expedition motto really is about reminding us that don't be very careful of making strategic decisions in the middle of storms. And when you look at, I break this down for me into my working environment during the week now as well. There's certain times in the day when I'm at my most cognitively alert, when I'm at my most aware, and when I'm most positive. And they are generally in the morning when the sun comes up. It's a new day, anywhere from 7 o'clock to up to lunchtime. I'm in a very good state of mind. Okay. Now get to say 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock at night. You've been sitting there looking at the computer screen the entire day. Kids have come back and they've been running around with them, trying to keep them happy, etc., etc. You're tired, and things that haven't gone very well during the day. That's a completely different decision-making time than it is in the morning, during those morning periods. So choose those periods of the day which you're mentally strongest and most cognitively alert to be making strategic decisions about the future of your expeditions, your projects, your business, whatever. That's the first one. The second the thing I think is really important about, having an adventurer's mindset, I call it the explorer's mindset, and navigating volatility, uncertainty, is having a really clear purpose and a set of values. And, this sounds really, really straightforward. And this is not new. This has been around for thousands of years. Okay, but it's amazing how many people don't know their own purpose, their own set of values, or they work in teams or organizations which have no idea what their purpose or their values are. or their values are some wishy-washy, ambiguous, overly fluffy, overly aspirational statements which are just stuck to their wallpaper, on the office wall. So I'm working with teams all the time to help them define their purpose and their values. On my expedition, my number one value is risk management. And it's not a single word, it has a behavior statement with it. My number one value is risk management. I always make the decisions so I'll come home safely to my family. That guides all of my decisions. That's my number one priority. When you have a set of values, they've got to prioritize them as well. Otherwise, it just becomes a game. You can pluck and cherry pick what value you want to use at what time. So that's the second one. The first one is beware making strategic decisions during a storm. The second one is having a very clear purpose and values and articulated in a very clear way. The third one is complex.
Just before you hop into number 3 there, Grant, that piece, I've been interviewing around 25 leaders for my next book, which is called Unshakable. We'll talk a little bit about that territory later on, but that thing about purpose comes up over and over again in those interviews. It's something that when the chips are really down, it acts as a bit of a lighthouse and provides direction and clarity and guidance. And it's a massive source of strength. And we've also seen here, I'm not sure, there's probably examples all around the planet, but, in Australia, we had the Royal Commission into the finance sector, into banking and other parts of that world. And some of the organisations that got most heavily exposed in that process had quite excellent purpose and value statements that were really well articulated and included signature behaviours and ways to prioritise and make decisions. But as you said, they're pretty much just the wallpaper on the wall, because the evidence was you're actually not living according to that. So it's not just a case of writing them, it's actually weaving them into the DNA somehow, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, writing them down is the easy part. I think Enron is a classic example of someone who integrity and trust and all this other stuff as well. It's like, oh, really? Okay.
So number 3.
Yeah, so number 3 is really, when you're out in the middle of an ocean, like the Tasman Sea especially, it's a very complex situation, especially with weather systems and trying to make predictions and small things. Trying to predict the future any more than 3 days out is very, very difficult. So it's a very complex decision-making environment that we're in the adventure world, and it's a very complex decision-making environment that we're all thrust into at this time. Complex decisions generally require higher levels of intelligence to solve. So trying to make decisions by yourself at this particular time around complex problems will be very, very challenging. So we need to harness the power of cognitive diversity and get other people involved in our decision-making process. So those are my three main tips from the adventurers, the explorer's mindset, Mike, about how to apply it to working in uncertainty.
Yeah, they're great. I think some very solid tactical and strategic territory there that would guide people well. You mentioned risk before, and I'm interested in your take on risk and how you weigh that up. Obviously, some of the things that you've done have a high inherent risk in them, and partly that comes from the uncertainty of outcome and the fact that you're often a long way from help if things do go wrong. And you speak to some people who are into sort of really high risk adventure, like, proximity wingsuit flying and things like that. And they have this fairly edgy view of, life, unless you're sort of standing right on the verge of death, doesn't really count. How do you weigh risk, and what's your general take on it, both in your adventures and explorations and more broadly in life?
Well, I think the question around risk for me is that there is no such thing as risk-free activities. Once you step outside the front door, there's nothing that's risk-free. You don't even have to step outside the front door, Grant. One of the examples I use on that front is in Perth here, WA, our capital city. There's around about 1 death on average per year
where somebody was asleep in their bed in their house and someone lost control of a car and drove through their bedroom wall and killed them. So you don't even have to leave your bed.
Terrible drivers there in Perth, Mike.
Oh, well, it's true. We're some of the worst drivers on the planet, I think.
Either that or you have your beds too close to the roundabout. So that's
possibly also true.
Yeah, no. So look, risk is one of the beautiful challenges that I love about my adventures is finding something which appears inherently very high risk and managing that level of risk to an acceptable level. So it's not about taking risk completely out of the equation. It's about how can you do something which looks really, really risky, like get in a tiny rowing boat and row, for 78 days across lots of seas and be hundreds of miles offshore with no support or anything. And how can you get the risk down to an acceptable level? So when I look at risk, that's the first thing, is that it's not that I don't love risk. I don't love just standing next to a very high drop-off and looking over just for the buzz. I love managing the risk down and working on strategies and techniques and ways to manage that level of risk down to an acceptable level. What that acceptable level is different to everybody. And on that particular note, it's always about risk versus reward for me. I don't look at every single mountain in the world and say, gee, I want to climb every single one. There's certain mountains which I look at and say, yes, that appeals to me and I want to climb it. And it's a very strong attraction. The reward for climbing that has to weigh and balance up with the risk of going there as well. So I think it's really important when we look at risk, we think, well, it's like, don't just tell people to go out and take risk. You need to go and take more risk. What's the reward? What's the possible reward that they're going to get out of it? Number one. And number two, how can you mitigate the risk to an acceptable level?
Yeah, nice. If we take a slightly sideways stint here, just to get a bit of a sense of the range of things that you've experienced personally in your various exploits across life. How would you describe your most profound pinnacle moment in all of the various things that you've done? What was it? Is there a point in time that stands out where you went, yeah, this is it? This is a really significant one.
Not really, to be honest. There's not an absolute pinnacle moment for me. But quitting my job after 17 years working in the corporate world to embark on a massive expedition and raise $500,000 in sponsorship and set off on this massively uncertain project to row a boat from Singapore to New Zealand. Having the courage to take that first step to go in there and literally leave the sanctuary of almost, you couldn't be much safer than having a well-established corporate position and throw all that away to go on this highly uncertain and what a lot of people would call a very high-risk project, especially when you have a family and you have children as well, which adds extra layers to the equation. I think that it's making that first step is one of the hardest things to do. That's one of the pinnacle moments that I can think of. I mean, in terms of just wonderful memories, standing on the summit of Everest on my second attempt in 2012 was just a wonderful moment, because that's for me, a very sacred, a very spiritual, a very, very special place, which is pretty hard to get to. You don't get to spend very much time up there. And what a magical part of the earth just to experience, even for 10 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. There's something about the effort involved, isn't there? There's certainly for me, a few of the really beautiful natural places that I've seen. There's something about actually getting there under your own power and the amount of effort that it takes to do that colours the experience beyond just the landscape and where you're physically located. There's something in there about the journey as well as the destination, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And taking planes so easily around the world as we used to be able to do, you don't really realize how much of it you're missing out on. I mean, for 15 years, I'd flown all the way from Singapore to New Zealand in the aeroplane. And it wasn't until I went on this expedition that I rowed a boat all the way from Singapore to Darwin, stopping at tiny little islands in Indonesia and East Timor, and arriving in Darwin. And then I ended up cycling all the way through the outback across Australia to the East Coast, which I've really started to explore and understand and come to love that part of the world, which most people never see, because you get in an airplane, you watch a movie, you have a glass of drink, you eat some food, you go to sleep, and suddenly you're halfway around the world, and you've missed out on the whole experience.
When you're talking to a lot of your corporate clients, a big piece that you do is around this notion of resilience, or even beyond resilience. So let's lead into that by looking at the polar opposite of where we've just been. What's been the hardest moment? I know when I've been out there doing some of the stuff that I've done, and you're way more prolific and certainly way longer duration than anything that I've undertaken. There's always moments where it seems a little bit insurmountable, that your physical and mental energy is at a real ebb, and you have a long way to go, and things are happening in the environment around you that just make it seem impossible. When it, as you said with the storms, if there was an eject button, you'd kind of take it at that moment. What's been the lowest point for you in life, where you've kind of really felt that your back's hard up against the wall and it seems almost impossible to go on?
Well, I think the mentally toughest time for me was when I made my first attempt to row across the Tasman Sea from east coast of Australia, from Coffs Harbour across to New Zealand. I ended up spending 24 days out at sea. It's about 2,400 kilometres from Australia to New Zealand in a straight line. I got out about 500 kilometres offshore. I got hit by storm after storm and weather system after weather system, and stuck in adverse current streams. And basically, to cut a long story short, I did the whole length of the Tasman Sea, 2,400 kilometres, but blown in a massive circle, and eventually blown back into the coastline of Australia, further away from New Zealand than when I'd left 24 days before. So those 24 days being stuck in a tiny little boat, being capsized, going upside down, way out offshore, in rough weather, and so little control of the situation. It's just so frustrating. And I'd spend my longest time was 3 days and nights strapped down inside my cabin without being able to get out of the boat. And I mean, that's like, can you imagine going to bed tonight and just strapping yourself into your bed, waking up the next morning, not being able to get out of bed, but laying in bed the whole day of the next day, strapped in, then the following night being strapped in, and then the following day being strapped in, and then the following night being strapped in, and the following day being strapped in. Can you imagine, what it's kind of like to go through that all the time, and are stuck in a dark little cabin, just hearing these massive waves coming to you like locomotions, like every 1 or 2 minutes is a and you're just sitting there, lying there, holding on. Let me shut that window because there's a bird outside here. Yeah, so that was very, very tough from a mental perspective to try to keep positive during those circumstances. It was really hard.
So there are those points, and many people would have experienced them during our current global situation as well, where it feels like, what's the point? How do we carry on? Assaulted by various levels of assault, from physically, life actually in danger, or friends and loved ones losing their life, businesses going under, all manner of assault. What's have you got a process that you use personally to kind of carry yourself through and out of those moments, and what kind of tactical advice do you give to your clients around that territory?
Yeah, good question. So I really break down this mental strength component, I break it down into two different areas. I think there's what I call short-term resilience, and there's long-term resilience.
Mm.
And short-term resilience to me is those things which get you through, hard times, when you're on the boat, when you're upside down, when you're stuck out there at sea. They get you through, a few hours or a few days or one day, or, for me, during the end of that 24 days, my techniques that I was using were only lasting for a few minutes at a time. I'd be cycling through this whole list of, mental strength kind of techniques. And then there's long-term resilience, which is completely different, and the term resilience doesn't even work for long-term resilience. It's something called a concept about being anti-fragile.
Mm.
So that's how I break it down: the short term kind of hacks, and then there's a long-term, much more stronger anti-fragility aspect of resilience.
So, what are a few of your go-tos in the short term, in those moments of sort of direct assault where you just need to sort of pull yourself up by the bootstraps and carry on?
Well, I mean, there's nothing rocket sciencey here. It's all fairly standard stuff, which you see spouted all around at the moment as well. I would try meditating. I try, taking my mind off it, and a supply of books on board the boat. I always reminded myself of the purpose of what I was doing out there. Reminded myself how lucky I was to be out there. At the end of it, the thing that, interestingly enough, the thing that worked the best at the end of it was something which I've applied in the last few weeks here as well, is that I reminded myself that, unlike day 18 or day 20 when I was on my boat going nowhere, going places, but in the wrong direction, I reminded myself that, what? I can't even remember what day 6 was like now. I can't even remember what day 12 was like. I can't even remember I can't even remember what happened yesterday. At the end of this, even though it's painful and horrible now, I'm not even going to remember it. And that's fun, interestingly enough, exactly the same as what's happened now. Because during this last 10 or 12 weeks, I can't even distinguish between what has happened, because we've been at home the whole time. Nothing. There's been no kind of events, and I just remind myself, like yesterday wasn't that good a day here. And I was like, you know what? I'm not even going to remember this in 3 or 4 weeks' time. So you just got to get through it. So that lasted for a short time. They worked for a short time for me.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And I think the 4Me is a great piece there too. As you say, there's a number of tactics and strategies in this sort of space that are well researched, evidence-based, useful, and I think there's also the personal recipe. So, certainly one of the things I encourage people to do is find what works for you. Just because it's great for one mind in one circumstance, it might not necessarily work for you, and finding the ingredients that do work for you is a really useful thing to do.
There is one thing I'd like to add in there, Mike. The thing about mental strength I think is very important is that for me it's very important to be very authentic with the fact that you don't have to be happy the whole time.
Yeah.
Okay. And giving advice to people, say you got to be positive. You got to be more positive. Just be positive. You got to look at the positive side of this. On day 18 on the boat, when I came out of the cabin after that 3 days and 3 nights, came out of the cabin, could finally get on the sat phone and make a call to the meteorologist who told me this one thing on day 18. I was already hundreds of kilometers off course. He said, "I've got some good news and some bad news, because everything on the boat, all your progress depends on the wind, what direction the wind's coming from." So I got good news and bad news. And I said, "Oh, give me the good news first." And he goes, "There's plenty of wind coming your way." And I said, "What's the bad news?" And he said, "It's coming from the wrong direction for the foreseeable future." Wow. For the next 2 weeks. For the next 2 weeks, as far as his predictions could see, the wind was coming from the wrong direction. You know, and as I said, I was already hundreds of kilometers of course for 3 days and 3 nights. I've been smashed in a storm, and I wasn't in a very good spot. And I called the project manager, and he said, "Stop worrying about the wind. There's no point worrying about the wind. You can't control the wind, so stop worrying about it, and just try and be happy and enjoy it out there." Well, I can tell you, even though he's a good friend of mine, if he'd been close to me on the boat, I would have punched him in the face. Because telling somebody just to be positive, even though it's well-meaning advice, when they're in a very stressful and emotional situation, is just counterproductive. It's like a kindergarten technique, and we have to realize that you don't have to be positive the whole time. Life is not about being positive the whole time. And it's okay to have a bad day. And when you have a bad day, all I needed him to say was, "You know what? You're having a shit time at the moment, and I can't imagine how difficult it must be out there on that boat at this time. Geez, it must be tough." That's all he needed to say, not just be positive. So we have to be very careful. Stop ramming just be positives down people's throat, especially when what they need is just to be listened to. They don't even need solutions sometimes. They just need an ear to be heard. Yeah, there's a difference also, Mike, between being optimistic and being positive. You can still have a bad day and feel like crap, but be optimistic about the future. I'm optimistic that COVID-19 will see the world come out in a much better place, but there's still a lot of crap going on, which is not much fun that we have to deal with, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Grant, Tom just asked in the chat box, what was the purpose that you reminded yourself of during that 24-day period? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, the purpose for me was fairly simple, Tom. It was to finish off this massive expedition. This was the final stage, the final phase of this massive expedition. You know, I had a documentary film crew who had invested 3 years of their life in this project. I had a whole team of people and 25 different sponsors, et cetera, et cetera. The purpose was crystal clear. And the problem was, no matter what I did physically as a human being, I just couldn't work towards that purpose. It was extremely frustrating. So for me at that particular time, the purpose of the expedition was probably frustrating me more than anything, because I couldn't get there. I was being blown further and further away from it. But the interesting part about the purpose is when I came back into shore, I came into an area of Australia I knew nothing about. It was a place called Ballina, a small prawn trawling port below Brisbane. I knew nothing about it. There was massive breaking surf in this bar on that particular day when I arrived. It was they'd actually closed the bar, not the bar in the drinking bar, but the surf bar, right? So they closed that, so the boats couldn't come out. So it was way too dangerous. And I found out later that Ballina is like one of the great white shark attack capitals of Australia too. I didn't know that at the time. But anyway, they said, "Oh, you can't row in here today." So I asked them if they would give me a tow in. So I was about 2 miles out. So they said, "Yeah." I said, "I'm in no danger, but could you come out and tow me?" And they said, "Well, the boat." The towing boat, the marine rescue boat, is in the prawn parade today. It's busy. There's a big parade in town. I said, no problem. That's fine. I'm in no danger. I'm perfectly happy. So I sat there for like 4 or 5 hours while they did their parade, and then they came out. During that 4 or 5 hours, I had time to think. Right, and I haven't got off the boat yet. I've been smashed. I'm exhausted, coming back in through the shipping lanes for 2 nights in very rough weather. I'm exhausted. I had time to think about the expedition and reflect back on the purpose. And I called the meteorologist before I got the tow in and said, "Look, I know what we need to do next. I've got to go down to the bottom of Australia, and the second attempt we'll make down from the bottom of Australia where the wind is going to be much more favourable." So before I'd even got off the boat on that first attempt, we'd made a decision that we'd learn from what we'd taken on board and make the second attempt. So the important thing about this, it kind of leads me to my next point, Mike, is that what I think we need at this particular time, or what I think is very, very useful. I use it myself. I don't I don't share things with people that that I don't use myself. There's this whole concept around we don't just need to be resilient. If you think about this whole model of resilience, and break it down into these three factors. The first is, being fragile, having a fragile kind of mindset, or a fragile system, or a fragile organization. Okay. Now, if you think of something which is fragile, you may look around your own office and just see an object which is fragile. It might be a glass, or it might be a painting hanging on the wall. Generally something that's fragile will break very easily when some kind of pressure is applied to it. Now, if you think what is the opposite of fragile, okay, most people will say words something along the lines of robust, or resilient, or strong. And resilient things, or robust things, or strong things, when an external force or change or pressure is applied to them, they hold their shape. They might be a bit scratched, might be a little bit bent, but they generally hold their shape, right? But by definition, if you take something which is fragile and you say, what is the opposite of fragile? It cannot be resilient. A fragile thing weakens or breaks under pressure. So the opposite of being fragile is it must get stronger. It must strengthen under pressure. And that is not resilient, because resilient things just hold their shape under pressure. They don't get stronger, they just hold their shape. So it turns out there's no real word in the English language for something which really defines what the opposite of fragile is. So, we use the term anti-fragile. And an anti-fragile, the concept of being anti-fragile, and this can be a mindset or it can be a strategic concept you can apply to your business or your teams as well. The concept of anti-fragility is that when external pressure or change occurs, we get stronger from it. We actually strengthen. Now, for me, anti-fragility is what resilience needs to be about. We need to stop thinking about trying to be resilient. And here's the reason. When you try and build something which is resilient, when you try and make something which is so strong that, it's not going to get bent out of shape, or external force is not going to change it, very often you're just fooling yourself. And very often you're actually making it fragile. A classic example of this, Mike, is your children. If you try and protect your children so much that you wrap them in cotton wool because you think, I don't want anything to harm them, I want them to stay in the same shape, I want them to blah, blah, blah. You think you're actually protecting them and making them resilient. Actually, children who come out like this sometimes are very, very fragile. If you look at businesses which try and be resilient, they think, strength is in numbers, let's get massive and build massive big headquarters and blah, 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 blah. Actually, when things change, they become very, very fragile because they can't adapt, or they're too big and too unwieldy. So this whole concept of anti-fragility, when I came off my boat, go back to Tom's great point about purpose there, the purpose didn't necessarily help me so much on that 24 days in terms of getting through the day-to-day bit, but in the bigger picture, as soon as I finished that 24 days, I was like, straight away, how can I learn from this and get stronger? As soon as I came off that boat, got on the bicycle, cycled 1,300 kilometers down to the south of Australia, headed off again on round number 2 to attempt the Tasman Sea in the southern Tasman route. That one failed as well. As soon as I got back into shore from that one, I thought, what can we change from that? What did we learn from that? That was a fantastic learning experience. Went for a third attempt. That one failed as well. After the third attempt, came back into shore. Again, what am I going to learn from that? The boat is definitely not the right boat from this. God, I've got so much experience now from these 3 attempts, 35 days out in the Tasman in all sorts of conditions. Just getting stronger. My experience is getting better all the time. Now we're building a new boat, completely designed for Tasman Sea conditions, going for a 4th attempt. That is the difference between an anti-fragile approach and just a resilient approach. And I think this is really important now, Mike, when we think about rebuilding, going into the rebuilding phase. Don't try and rebuild your businesses, your teams, your mindsets with resilience. Build them with an anti-fragile mindset.
Yeah, I really like that, Grant. One of the things I've been saying to clients has been, we don't we don't want to go back to business as usual. We actually don't want to return to normal, because that misses a massive opportunity of the learnings of the journey that COVID's presented to us. And as you said, you know, there's many aspects of it that we wouldn't wish upon ourselves and certainly wouldn't want to repeat. But just to snap back to how things were misses so much value and so much potential. Do you reckon that's as simple as making a decision to adopt that kind of mindset and stance, Grant?
So anti-fragility, you know, there's a lot of fluffy stuff around, especially around the mindset piece, which can be a little bit abstract and hard to apply, but anti-fragility is much more than just a mindset. In my case, I explained it as a mindset piece about how I get stronger with each one of these attempts on the Tasman Sea. But you can apply it also in a strategic sense to the way you run your business, you rebuild your business, the way you form your teams. Let me give you an example I'll give you an example of something. You tell me if it's fragile, resilient, or anti-fragile. A business which at the start of coronavirus was running along, everything was going quite well. Suddenly coronavirus hit, and within 2 months their cash flow dried up and they were knocking on the door of bankruptcy. Within 2 months of the coronavirus pandemic, they were knocking on the door of bankruptcy and about to go belly up. Are they fragile, resilient, or anti-fragile? What do you guys think?
Fragile.
Very, very fragile. Extremely fragile. Okay, so let's take another example. A business, coronavirus hit, and they're like, whoop, cash flow's completely dried up, but we have some capital reserves. You know, we've got enough cash reserves. We look at our run rate, we've got enough for 12 months. We're going to put our people down to 80% or 60%, and we're going to make some cutbacks where we can, blah, 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 blah. But we can get through the next 12 months, and hopefully when things start to pick up again, we can take off where we were. What do you think they are?
That sounds resilient.
Exactly, yeah, it's more of a resilient. You're doing very well at this, Mike. I'm impressed.
We're not bad at some of this stuff, us Aussies.
Or Mike, or take this example. This is a true example from my friend. This didn't happen, this global pandemic, it happened in 2008. He worked for a removal company, or one of those companies which moves people in and out, expatriates in and out. And we had a big financial meltdown here in 2008. And everyone was losing their jobs and being sent home. And I was talking to him one day, I said, man, it must be tough for you guys. You know, you're in the moving business, moving people in. And he goes, what are you talking about? It's fantastic. Couldn't be much better. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, when things are going great, we move all the expats into Singapore. And then when things go wrong, now we move them all home for the next 2 or 3 years. And when it turns around and comes back in again, we're going to move them all back in again. That is a great example of anti-fragility, being anti-fragile. So just taking the concept of anti-fragile and thinking about it in your own organization. Am I actually fragile, resilient, or anti-fragile? Are we, what are we in? Are we, is this, and there might be certain parts of your organization which are fragile, completely reliant on one particular thing.
I like it. It's a great frame for assessing where you're at, and also pointing the way for being better and stronger. Grant, we're pretty much out of time. We could keep going on this all day. There's so many lids that I would like to open and peer into in more detail, and I'm sure that we could do that. That'll be time for another conversation, perhaps. If people want to get hold of you, find out more about you and the work that you do and upcoming expeditions, and get you involved in their businesses, etc., what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so thanks, Mike. First of all, it's been wonderful to be here today. I just had one question from Doug there. Grant, you know Erden Eric. He actually added me to LinkedIn as a contact 2 or 3 weeks ago, Doug. So we just had a little bit of a chat on LinkedIn a few weeks ago. So I don't know him, haven't met him face to face, but he's another very well-known human-powered adventurer.
Well, he's about to arrive in New Zealand.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, I'm not sure how he's arriving there.
He sailed from San Diego straight to New Zealand because he couldn't stop at any of the islands.
Right. Well, I hope they let him in. That's all. Mike, how can people get hold of me?
Yes.
My website, my business is Powerful Humans. That's a powerful with a hyphen humans. www.powerful-humans.com. Yeah, I'm based here in Singapore, and yeah, that's where I run the business from, coaching, speaking, and running, especially decision-making workshops.
Great. Thanks very much for your time, Grant. It's been wonderful talking to you and getting your perspective. So richly coloured by all those years and miles of adventurous human-powered exploration, and also your experience in the corporate world as well, and as a family person too. Thanks for the diversity you've brought to the conversation.